In this scenario, we're going to discuss, what if Ukraine lost the Ukraine crisis? But before we explain what would happen, we need to understand why the crisis began. Ukraine is very divided both culturally and politically, with a lot of Eastern Ukrainians speaking Russian and identifying more with Russia, and the Western Ukrainians speaking Ukrainian and identifying with the EU. During World War II, Ukraine was a battlefield and its population significantly decreased. The infrastructure was heavily damaged and it required human and capital resources to be rebuilt. This resulted in the famines of 1931 to 1932 and a third in 1947. Near the end of the war, the entire population of Crimean Tatars was expelled from their homeland in Crimea to Central Asia under accusations of collaborations with the Germans. Crimea was then repopulated by the new wave of Russia and Ukrainian settlers. The Russian population in Crimea went from 47% in 1937 to almost 61% in 1993, while the Ukrainian population in Crimea went from 13% in 1937 to almost 24% in 1993. On the 21st of November 2013, when the then President Viktor Yanukovych suspended preparations for the implementation of an association agreement with the EU and cited a deal with Russia, this resulted in mass protests by its opponents known as the Euromaidan. These protests were mainly in the West. The Ukrainian government at the time tried to suppress these protests, but when protesters died, the numbers of the protesters multiplied and turned deadly, with protesters fighting the police and rioting occurred. Soon the then president fled the country and the country held new elections, but in that time pro-Russia protests started in the east. Regions like Donetsk and Luhansk had armed militants storm government buildings. There are two parts to this scenario. Part one being if the republics were to get recognized by the Western world. This is unlikely, but for the scenario we would say that Russia and the republics both offer cheaper gas prices to the EU in exchange for the recognition of the republics. This would anger many countries such as the United States and Great Britain, but it is likely that countries that are more heavily dependent on gas imports, like Germany, would be for the deal. After being recognized, it's likely that these two republics would be annexed by Russia in a referendum. Political tension would have risen, but in our timeline, the Western world didn't use military force in the referendum in Crimea, so we'd say it's likely that they wouldn't hear either. The second part would be an invasion by these two republics. It is likely that the republics would be armed by Russia and, like now, have the men in green, which are Russian soldiers without their uniform fighting alongside the republics. This would be met with force from the West. The republics would be well equipped, and the threat of Russian nuclear weapons in these regions aimed at Ukraine may stop Ukraine from joining the EU. The West might propose a deal for a multinational anti-terrorism force to help Ukraine to defend itself from the invasion. Sanctions from the West would cripple Russia's already unstable economy. This would leave Ukraine in ruins from constant fighting. These are only scenarios, but it's also fun to speculate what would or could happen in the future. Thanks for watching.